Nigel Hawkes was a British journalist who graduated from Oxford University. For decades, he wrote in such prominent journals as Nature, the British Medical Journal, and the London Times. Just a few years ago, Hawkes wrote an article in the London Times where he had interviewed physicians who stated that in the near future that they would be able to extend human life to 100, even 15 years. The evidence was startling. And yet at the end of this article about this long life, Nigel Hawkes asked a very penetrating question. Would it be a life worth living? Hi, my name is Michael Wolfe, and I want to begin a study with you asking a question on what is a life worth living. I think we would all like to know that. We'd all like to have a more abundant and joyful life. And yet, what makes life worth living? Is it only a long life, or is it something else completely? I want to look today at the first chapter of the letter to the Philippians in the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul writes about this kind of joyful, abundant living. This is one of 4 letters that Paul wrote while he was actually in prison. He was in prison, in a Roman prison, and would eventually be executed. And yet he writes in this letter about joyful, abundant living. How can that be? How can this man in such a difficult circumstance write about the joy of life? And yet this letter of Philippians is often considered the most joyful letter writing in the entire Bible. Philippians begins with the words, "I thank my God in all my prayers for you." It's a very intimate greeting. Paul uses the same words to begin Romans and 1 Corinthians. I thank my God. I think this is one of the first secrets of Paul's joyful, abundant living. He says, my God. Paul doesn't refer to God in some distant terms or some academic manner or even in a general fashion, but he talks about my God. It's a very personal, heartfelt, intimate relationship with his God. Now, Paul did not always have this kind of close, intimate relationship with his God. In fact, as a young man, Paul was more interested in religion and rules and keeping certain legal codes. Paul was especially concerned about people from other ethnic groups who might try to come into his faith. He was concerned about those who didn't live life the way he would live it. And in fact, Paul sought to have those people arrested or put away. But on the road to Damascus, Paul had a life-changing experience where he discovered more than just religion and rules. He discovered his God, an intimate relationship of the heart. Why is such a heart with God important for joyful living? Well, if you look in Philippians chapter 1, verses 6 and following, you'll see Paul continues writing. He says, I am confident. He says, I am certain that the God who began a good work in you will carry it through to completion. Do you hear those words? I am confident. You see, Paul had found a joy in living because he was confident in God. He had found release from many of the worries and stress and anxiety that plague so many of us. Paul may have been in prison, but he was still certain of God. Paul was not clear about his future, but he was confident about his God. Just a few months ago, on Sunday, April 22nd, a group of extremists killed 19 Christians who were worshiping on the campus of Bayero University in Nigeria. Among those killed were 2 professors. There were additional 22 people who were injured. These were Christians who were there worshiping from 2 different churches, one Protestant and one Catholic. When the gunmen attacked them, hurling explosives into the crowd, and then shooting after those who were fleeing. It was a terrible situation. And yet the bishop there in Nigeria urged Christians not to have retaliation or revenge, but rather to continue joyfully in prayer. You know, for many of us, we are brought low by just common hassles of daily living. And yet many Christians throughout history have found the secret of joyful, abundant living, of being confident in their God. What did Paul's new heart do for him? What did this confidence in God do for him? Well, it brought him close to people. If you look at verses 7 and 8, Paul writes here, he says, "It is right for me to feel this way about all of you, since I have you in my heart. God knows how I long for all of you with the love of Jesus Christ." You know, it seems to me that the Apostle Paul has often acquired a reputation for being some kind of a hard-nosed individual, maybe a man who was hard to get along with. But you know, in his letters, we find this type of love language for people. We know Paul traveled all over the Mediterranean world, and he had deep, close friendships with people in town after town, everywhere he went, because he had this kind of love relationship with people. I'm reminded of a song by the songwriter Jimmy Buffett. It's called Jolly Mon. Buffett in this song writes about a traveling minstrel who travels about the Caribbean from island to island. And Buffett says this: "He would tell them of their joys, he'd tell them of their woes. They'd love to see him come, they'd hate to see him go." It's a nice little song, the Jolly Mon. You know, Paul was that kind of jolly mon. He traveled about the Mediterranean world, had close friendships with so many people, and they would love to see him come. They would hate to see him go. Paul's joy in life, Paul's closeness to God, Paul's confidence in God, they brought him close in love with people. And that was part of his secret for joyful living. The same can be true for us. We find joyful living in a close relationship with God, in having confidence in God, and in drawing closer to other people. I'll be back perhaps next week, and we'll continue to look at what is a life worth living, a life of joy in God.